Welcome to part 2 of qualitative evaluations, where we talk about semi-structured interviews and some other miscellaneous types of qualitative evaluations. Your text has some great information on how to go about conducting semi-structured interviews and what are the pros and cons and so forth. And I like how they start saying, if this doesn't meet your needs, read no further. These are all the disadvantages. Just a great overview. So in general, we know that their semi-structured interviews are really great for formative evaluations. So during the process of the program, where you want to really find out what's going well and what's not going so well, so that you can revise things before you get to the end. And of course, going to want to keep very careful records of what you do and why if you do make some revisions to a program or an intervention. It really provides a great structure for getting more confidential or candid responses from people. In other words, when they're alone with you and not in a big group. Although you might do semi-structured interviews in very small groups, 2 or 3 at a time, but the most confidential and candid responses, of course, are going to be more on a one-on-one basis if the stakeholder trusts you. It can help with creating a survey from the get-go, and when we talk about creating surveys in a few weeks from now, we'll talk about that in terms of how most people start by querying the experts about what they should include in the survey, or so the experts and the stakeholders to help you formulate those questions. So it can be very helpful in that area. And of course, in nursing and other disciplines, we use semi-structured interviews in phenomenology to understand the lived experience of a specific population. And I'll be talking about my experience with that with Dr. Danuta Voinar when we interviewed Somali parents. We want to have a predetermined checklist and some open-ended questions that we're going to ask, at least from the beginning. Those might change somewhat, but you want to be consistent, of course, across the interviews so that you can compare answers. Again, orchestrating these interviews can be a little tricky at times if people get off topic, just like in focus groups. If at all possible, record the sessions, and so that you have transcripts again that you can look back at. And of course, the key is always in listening in these kinds of techniques. And I've included a link on the Canvas website to a piece on qualitative listening by Dr. Kruger. It's an interview with him. He is a guy from the University of Minnesota who has done a lot of qualitative research, written several books. He's absolutely wonderful. So I really encourage you to go to this website to read about the kinds of things that he thinks about when he's doing interviews and how he orchestrates those interviews and listens in a very qualitative, unbiased way. He's just amazing. The analysis of qualitative data, as many of you know, can be quite labor intensive. By the time you get transcripts typed up, hopefully by someone else, because doing them yourself, of course, adds to the labor, and then many people go through by hand and look for codes and so forth. They look for themes and sub-themes. There is software, I've listed a couple here, that can help you identify patterns, but then I've found, with the limited experience I have with that you also need to go through and verify by hand and see if the software has actually missed anything. And of course, it really depends on people using specific key words. If they use substitutes, then the software may not pick that up. There's also software that looks at, can compare multiple data sources, and I don't know that any of you are looking at that, but Atlas and Noldus are 2 of those, kind of interestingly. I have looked at the Noldus software. I haven't used it. I was involved in a study where we have physiological data plus films of people as they're interacting. So we recorded their heart rate and respirations and so forth, and we're looking for their emotional response as they talked. So we have families solving a problem together and some other kinds of interactions that we were coding. And this is very labor intensive too, deciding what you're going to code ahead of time, what you'll be looking for. And the way we started the project was to observe, keep stopping the film, listen for keywords, and then go through again and watch people's faces. So Noldus can actually look at keywords, identify them, and the physiological response at the same time, and um, and also facial expressions. It's really amazing. It's not perfect, but it is some pretty amazing software. So, and more is coming out all the time. Atlas I don't know so much about, but it is able to look at multiple things when you have videos of people. Again, we're going to want to look for themes and sub-themes across the participants. What keeps coming up, and I think that's a little bit easier when you're evaluating a program to get those themes and sub-themes. You want independent coding and validation. So as you identify themes, the way I have participated in doing this is to do it separately. So have at least 2 people, if not 3, look at the transcripts, identify themes, preliminarily, and then come together as a group to validate with each other. And then, of course, you need to go back to the participants and verify with them, is this what we heard? Was this correct? Is this what you meant? And see what their reaction is. And that can be very powerful for the participants to feel very validated about their participation in this process, and that it's going to make a difference in the changing of the program and so forth as well. So, well, I was very disappointed to see that my picture, the one that Danita and I created for our presenting the findings on the interviews with Somali families, did not come through on here. So I posted this one slide to Canvas so you can see an example of how we summarize that. And we found several sub-themes, or at least a few for each perspective. And then basically what we decided, or the overarching theme was, when we really compiled all of the data, is that the Somali parents felt that parenting in the USA is just a real balancing act for them. There's the Somali piece and the American piece. And on the Somali side, they're feeling like they really need to preserve their culture and their religion, and they do many things to do that, they value those traditional ways of parenting and drawing strength from community wisdom, which is really the underpinnings of how that community comes together to parent children. But then on the American perspective, they said, they live in fear quite often and experience conflict within that system. They live in fear because some of them have had experience with teachers calling CPS when they sort of misunderstood things, and the stories just would go through wildfire through the community. It was amazing, because it's a very tight-knit community. And they're striving to understand and embrace, that new world, and yearning to be understood and supported. So look at us. We really need to be understood. We have some things to bring to the table as well. And also, though, they acknowledge the benefits of having their children in the U.S. and having access to an amazing education. Many of the parents in our sample had not finished grade school, so we're very, very appreciative of that piece. But overall, this balancing act. And then quite often when we do these kinds of interviews, it's very powerful to support our conclusions with specific quotes. So we had several that we felt really supported our findings. And in terms of a balancing act, one of the moms said, a lot of Somalis, when they come here, will try to conserve our, our culture and do everything the old way, including parenting. And then there are people who come to the U.S. and try to act American, Western. They like to drink and everything. You know, mainly men are like that. There are also people who just try to stay in their corner and pretend nothing's changed. And there are also people that fall in between. I think the hardest thing is when you feel you're stuck and you're unable to reconcile the differences. So we thought that was a real powerful statement, and that eventually you have to come to this point where you have both and you reconcile the differences and hopefully embrace the best of each. So a laundry list of other qualitative approaches. Each of these we could go into great detail, and if you're interested in employing one, I really encourage you to do that and ask me for any other information if you need it. But appreciative inquiry is a really nice one if you want to find out what's going well with something. Not only does this help you to identify what's going well and how can you perhaps build on that, but it's a great team building kind of experience, I think, for the participants. So if you want to keep people away from just complaining, it really, I think, raises morale. And then particularly if you share the results with the group afterwards, it's really enables people to appreciate what's going well about a project. And I know those of you who are in Danuta's class, her research class, actually did this about the DNP program, I think the first week of class or so, she was telling me. Document and record review, of course, we use a lot in healthcare where we do audits and so forth. But from a qualitative standpoint, it's also very helpful to look at narrative notes, or meeting notes is used quite often. I know my friend Julie Postma, who's at Washington State in Spokane, used this approach in her dissertation where she looked at meeting minutes of community members because she wanted to see how well were underrepresented community members represented in a community meeting. And particularly the Hispanic farm workers, as I believe is what she was looking at. And what she found, sorry, needed to tap my little dog to tell him to be quiet. What she found was that they were very underrepresented, and so one of the things that they did was to start conducting the meetings in Spanish rather than English, and they switched the tables to have interpreters for those people who spoke English as a first language. They had interpreters for them rather than the other way around, and it really shifted the power base, and the participation, of course, went way up by the Spanish speakers. It was really an interesting and worthwhile project in farm communities in eastern Washington. And I've used this with a colleague, Deborah Phillips, so we just have a paper coming out about a project where we reviewed a year's worth of charts at an inpatient psych unit to see how were people describing violence of sibling against siblings. And it's kind of a long story, but the descriptors were very interesting and were quite often lacking. So what we came away with was that people downplay this, and we also found it was very underrepresented. It wasn't recorded or even looked at, and yet there were many indications in the charts that siblings and family members were really being beat up on and harmed by the mentally ill child in the family. So we have some follow-up recommendations on that I'm hoping to implement at one of the psych units in the area. So it was a tremendous amount of work. We had a couple of grad students working with us for their senior synthesis projects, but very worthwhile in terms of what we found out, because it really gave the